So, moving on to the first of those questions. Simply put, you need to secure permission when a work is protected by copyright. In other words, when it is owned by someone else. A work may be literary, it may be text, lyrics, tables, etc. It could be dramatic, it could be artistic, which means, for example, illustrations and photographs, or it could be musical. There's a more comprehensive list on the Intellectual Property Office website, so if you need to find out more information, go there. So, moving on, what does protected by copyright mean? Well, under the Copyright Design and Patents Act of 1988, creators are given exclusive rights in works that are original and not copied from other works. The most significant of those rights is the exclusive right to reproduce, or in other words, copy works and distribute them to the public. Other rights include the right to rent or lend, to perform in public, to communicate to the public, and to adapt the work. So if you wish to use copyright works in any of these ways, then you need to secure permission. And I think it's worth highlighting at this point that should you find any content on the internet that doesn't alter its copyright status. So unless there's wording to the contrary, such as a Creative Commons license or an open government license, you can't reuse it without permission. So does this mean that you should ask the creator directly for permission? Well, generally not, because most creators assign or license the rights granted under the Copyright Act to publishers. And the underlying reason for this is simply that publishers are in a good position to help with the publication and promotion of these works. So, generally speaking, requests to reuse content should be made to the publisher in the first instance, and then the publisher may, as appropriate, forward on to an author or a literary agent. There are rare circumstances in which actually it's not possible to identify or trace a rights holder. There's now potentially a solution to this problem in the UK. You may be able to secure an orphan works license to reuse the content from the Intellectual Property Office. Before you do that, before that license will be issued, you'll need to demonstrate that you've done a diligent search using tools like PLS Clear. And again, you can find more details about this process on the Intellectual Property Office website. So, moving on to the next question, and when do I not need permission? Well, you don't need permission in the circumstances listed here. So you don't need to ask permission when a work is out of copyright. You don't need permission when what you're planning to reuse is not substantial. And lastly, you don't need permission when a statutory copyright exception applies. In other words, when the reuse is covered by fair dealing. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn in a bit more detail. So firstly, when's a work out of copyright? I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the general rule, which is that copyright protection lasts for an author's life plus 70 years. So in other words, if the author is deceased and 70 years have passed, you can reuse the work without permission. If there's more than one author, as is often the case with scholarly works, it will be 70 years after the death of the last surviving author. That's the general rule. There are also some variations to that. So when the work hasn't been made available to the public during the author's lifetime, when the work is anonymous, when it's covered by Crown and Parliamentary copyright, when it's a translation, and when you're dealing with a typographical arrangement. If your intended reuse falls under any of these categories, we would recommend that you consult the Society of Authors permissions guidelines for more details. So moving on to the second set of circumstances. How do you know when the content that you're planning to reuse is not substantial? Well, the Copyright Act, unfortunately, doesn't define what substantial is, so that's been left to the courts. And the courts have applied a subjective test, which means that in each particular case, they've considered the quality rather than the quantity of the material used. So what that means specifically is if you plan to reuse a few sentences from a long novel, if that sentence was, "You should turn left at the lights," for example, that probably wouldn't be considered substantial. But if you were using a line or so from a poem, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," for example, then that may well be considered substantial. So if you're in doubt, either contact the rights holder using a system like PLS Clear, or seek advice from a qualified lawyer. Moving on now to the last set of circumstances in which you do not need permission. This is when reuse is covered by fair dealing. So the Copyright Act lists various categories of reuse, and the rationale for listing these is that they are reuse categories of reuse that are considered generally to be in the public interest. So the way the fair dealing test works is that you first need to consider whether your intended reuse falls into any of the categories, and then you need to consider whether it's fair. So it's a two-step process. I've listed the most significant categories here. So research for non-commercial purposes, private study, criticism, review and quotation, reporting current events, caricature, parody or pastiche, and illustration for instruction. So if your planned reuse falls into any of these categories, then you can then move on to consider whether what you're planning to do is fair. The Copyright Act doesn't define what fair is, so again this is something that's left for the courts and is determined on a case-by-case basis. There are some general considerations, so principally whether the content that you're planning to reuse is for a rival purpose. In other words, does it interfere with the sales of the original work, and also how much of the original work is being reused and how important is it judged to be. If you're unsure about whether what you're planning to reuse content for does constitute fair dealing, then we suggest contacting the rights holder or again consulting with a qualified lawyer. If you're confident that your planned reuse does fall within the fair dealing category, then there is an additional requirement, and that is that you provide sufficient acknowledgement of the source, and that's usually noting the work in question and the publisher involved. Before we move on, I'd just like to highlight the fact that fair dealing is not the same as fair use, and that there's often confusion between the two. Fair use is a legal concept used in the US, and it's significantly different from fair dealing in the UK. Specifically, the US Copyright Act doesn't limit fair use to predefined categories, and it can thus be applied more broadly and arguably more flexibly. So I'm now going to move on to the third question, And before I hand over to Rachel, I just point out that traditionally, in the past, and to a significant extent currently, requesters often find it very difficult to secure permission. It can be a very frustrating and protracted process. And the kinds of problems that arise include it's really difficult to identify who the current rights holder is. Even if you can do that, it's not clear who you need to contact. It's not clear what kind of information you need to supply to ensure a quick response. It's not clear how much you'll be charged or whether you'll be charged at all. And the consequence of these difficulties is that the process can take a long time. So response rates range between a few days, but extend up to 12 weeks or more. And there are plenty of instances where lengthy delays have impacted upon publishing schedules, particularly when requests are made at the end of the writing process. So we're now going to talk about solutions. So what is it that will make it easier to secure permission? So most significantly, software has been developed to streamline the process by automating the issuing of licenses. And there are various digital copyright exchanges in existence. In the US, the Copyright Clearance Center has developed copyright.com and also RightsLink, which is particularly useful for academic and scholarly requests and is used by many of the larger international publishers. In Australia, they've recently launched something called the Rights Portal, and in the UK, there is PLS Clear, which has been available for some 18 months or so now, and we're going to talk about how that works in a bit more detail now. Before we move on now, I should mention also that there are a few publishers who have developed their own solutions, and most notably Faber and Faber. But there are many benefits of using a more general digital copyright exchange, and we're going to talk about those now. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel.
So, hi everyone. So I'm going to talk about PLS Clear, which Jonathan just mentioned is a digital service that has been developed by PLS. So it's a tool, so basically it's a facilitation service. So that helps with the permissions process to help streamline it. So I'll just quickly go through the benefits of using it, and then I'll show you a demonstration. So the first benefit of using PLS Clear is that it helps to identify who the current rights holder is. So we have a database that we use for collective licensing that has quite a number of publishers signed up to and quite a number of titles. The PLS Clear database is also supplemented by feeds from, apologies, sorry. So yeah, the database is also supplemented by Valka and Nielsen, so there are around 50 million titles that are available to be searched within PLS Clear. So in terms of finding the right contact, because we have a number of publishers signed up to us, the permissions request will go straight through to those contacts that we have on our system in a very seamless process. So it will go straight through to them. Secondly, within PLS Clear, there is a wizard which I'll show you in a moment, which is a set of questions which have been developed by permission specialists. So all of the information that that they will need to make a decision about whether to grant your permissions request is captured on the first attempt, so there should be minimal back and forth requesting further information. Thirdly, it's a very time-saving, very time-efficient service. So another thing that I'll show you for requesters is the ability to create and manage projects. So if you're working on a number of different titles, you can save the details of the reuse. So for the next request that you make and those going forward, you can select the project from a drop-down box, which I'll show you. And that saves you filling out all of that information over and over again. So the fourth thing is that, as Jonathan said before, the automated licensing. So within PLS Clear at the moment, we have free of charge licensing that publishers can set and opt into. So that means if you're, for example, if you're looking to reuse content to write a dissertation or a thesis, if a publisher has opted in their content into those particular licenses and have chosen to automate them, as soon as you submit the permissions request, you may receive an instant response with a license to say that it's been granted. We currently are developing fee payable licensing, which is due out next year. So you'll then be able to make permissions requests and then pay through the system as well. So everything will be handled within one place. Finally, we also have a dedicated help desk. So 9 out of 10 times the content is, the title you're looking for is found in the system and everything goes through with no problems. 1 in 10 times we will receive some obscure request from somewhere. And that does require some intervention. So we have a help desk and it's their job to find if they can find a rights holder, if so, is there a contact that they can get hold of, and then they can forward the request on if possible. So I will now show you a demonstration of the system itself. If you bear with me 1 second. So this is PLS Clear, this is the home page. When you use the system as a requester, you will need to sign up at some point. You can either do it at the beginning, so in the top right hand corner you can see there's a register button. So you can click on that and register in the beginning, or it's fine, you can submit your first permissions request and then register at the end. So I'll walk you through as a brand new user. So here you enter in the title you want to use and click on enter. So this will bring up all of the titles with that term. So when you're searching, you can search by keyword, title, author, or the ISBN or ISSN. We would always recommend, where possible, to search by the identifier, i.e. this one. So, for example, because I've searched for nanotechnology, that's brought back 424 results. So unless you're very confident that this is the title that you're looking for, you receive quite a few number of results come back. If you have the ISBN or ISSN, it will bring back just the one. So we'll use this one as an example. So this is the start of the wizard. So here you can type in what kind of content you want to reuse. So it's there's a lot of helped prompts on the website. So for example, with this, there's a blue banner on every screen. So if you click on the little more button, you'll see a drop down of lots of helpful information. Also, you will see these blue bubbles everywhere that gives you kind of more information what we're looking for. So in terms of the kind of content that we can deal with, so you can see it's a text extract, poem, illustration or diagram, table or chart, or a complete article. So in terms of content that we can't push through, so we don't deal with newspapers. If you want to reuse newspaper content, then you'll need to go directly to the newspaper publisher themselves. We don't deal with music. If you want to reuse lyrics or score, you will need to go to the MPA, which is the Music Publishers Association. We also do not deal with photography, and again, in this case, you will need to go directly to the photographer to ask for the permission. Websites is another one, so you will need to contact the rights holder of the website. And finally with poems, so we do deal with poems, which you can see here. So generally if a poem has an identifier, so say for example a lot of big publishers publish collections and anthologies, and if they have an ISBN, then you're more than welcome to push them through. Poems that appear online by anonymous poets or by poets that you can't find contact details for, they're a little more obscure, so there's a very helpful resource called the Poetry Library, which you can go to, and they can help. So going back to the demonstration, we'll put in one text extract for reuse. So here you enter the details of the content that you want to reuse. So for example, so there are a number of questions, but there's only 3 required fields here. So the required fields are the absolute minimum information that a publisher will need to see before making a decision. If you can put in as much information as possible, then that's even better, but as the bare minimum, these are the 3 required fields. So I'll just pop some information in here before moving on. Again, there's, like I said before, there's all these helpful bubbles everywhere, so if you don't know what the exact number of words are, there's around 400 a page. So I'll say I'm the author and click on continue. So this is where you select your planned reuse. So there's a lot of options. So you can click on as many as you like. So say for example I wanted to reuse the information in a journal, so print, digital, let's go for thesis as well. So if you've accidentally clicked on too many, you can just get rid of them by clicking on the little crosses. Yeah, and then we continue. So this section is where you enter the information where you're going to reuse it, so what the publication is going to be when it comes out. So say for example here the publication title is going to be Nanotechnology Discovery, and the publisher is Scientific Publishing. Yeah, and then you just need to enter in, again, as much information as you possibly can, but territories we definitely would need to know, and what the circulation will be. So, and when you then log in later on and you want to set up a project, this section here you can automatically have filled in by selecting one of the projects. So, saves a lot of time. So if you then click on continue, you will then you can then review your request. So this is what you're applying for, and then it will be used in this publication. So here is where you enter your email address. If the system recognizes you as a user, you'll be prompted to enter your password. If not, you will then be asked to enter your details, and when you click on continue, it will submit the you will then receive an email, to say please set up a password, and then you can have access to your account. So until you set up an account with a password, the request will be held. So you may need to make sure that you go and set up a password, log into the account to make sure that the request goes through to the publisher. So we'll click on continue. Apologies. Cool. So, yeah. So when you haven't set up a password, you will get this message. So you just need to make sure you check your emails and log in. So we'll go back here, and I will show you what happens to the request once it's gone through. So in PLS Clear, we have what we call a request manager, which is essentially an inbox, which shows you all of the requests that you've pushed through, which run down here under the title and then the ID. It will tell you the date they've been raised, and then in the column to the right you can see lots and lots of different symbols. This shows you the status that the request is at this point in time, and you can see down here there's a key. So, for example, those particular titles that are opted into free of charge as is this one. So you can see here that it says FOC here, and then there's a tick there to say that a license has been issued. So when you click on the request itself, you can see what you have submitted. Here is what the publisher has submitted in the grey box. So here is where you can download your license agreement. So any communication that happens between you and a publisher will happen through the system here. Licenses aren't emailed to you, they will appear here within the request manager itself, so everything's in one handy place and you don't have to keep track of loads and loads of different emails. So everything's here. We don't send out email notifications at the moment, so you do need to make sure that you log in every so often to check and make sure that if you've had a response or not. So we'll just close this one. So if a publisher does respond to a request, what will happen, it will be in this orange text and it will be in bold and it will go to the top of the page. So anything here that's not in orange, that means you've looked at it and you don't need to look at it again until something else changes. So for example, with the one that we've just pushed through for nanotechnology, so if you haven't had a response and you want to chase up the publisher, you can enter that here. So we can say, please respond to my request. And when you press send, the publishers have the access to the exact same request manager their end, so they will pick up this message directly. So that's pretty much it. The only other thing I will say that under the sent request here, you can see that all of the projects that you set up, they then have their own neat little folders. So if you're looking particularly, say for example, let's look at your thesis, anything that's made under that project will go in here. So if you're managing a number of different projects, a number of different books, you can split them out into the projects and they will all appear in their own sections. If anyone has any questions about the system, please feel free to put it in the chat box and I'll be happy to answer in the question section. So just before I hand back to Jonathan, I'll just quickly go through just a recap of our top tips. So please ensure you submit your permissions request in plenty of time. So publishers have a very varied response rate, so it can be anywhere from a day or two, anything up to 16 weeks. So if you're looking to get something cleared within a week, please make sure you do it in plenty of time. Again, to make sure you find the right title the first time, please search by the ISSN or ISBN. If you're using content from a journal, search for the ISSN of the journal rather than the DOI or the article name, as we don't store article level data at this moment. And then finally, in terms of the titles that you're requesting, particularly for books, it's handy to know whether the title's been republished recently. So you can easily check this by using Amazon. You can search for the title name and the author, and whatever has the most recent publication date, use that particular one, because that will be the most up-to-date. And also, if you have a copy of the book, does the publisher name match what we've got in PLS Clear? If not, there's a good chance that it has been republished by somebody else more recently. So that's my section done. So I'm going to hand you back over to Jonathan, who will talk to you about charging.
Or actually, rather, I won't. So we know that one of the questions that often arises is how much will a rights holder charge to reuse content, and the reality is that is really entirely at the discretion of the rights holder. We know, generally speaking, that a fee may be charged, but actually, based upon the research that we've done, anything up to 50% of requests are actually granted free of charge, and there may be some very exceptional instances where the permission is not granted. So moving on to the final question, which is what happens if you reuse content without securing permission Well, there are a range of dire consequences potentially of this. Firstly, the publisher may ask, or the rights holder may ask for the work to be withdrawn, and most of the larger publishers have account stories of when they have had to halt print runs because they had not secured permission. The rights holder may just ask for an acknowledgement in the work, which again may have financial implications. They could ask for a fee, or they could ask for a share of revenues, or they could ask for a public apology. And about 6 months ago now, a publisher was required to issue an apology in the bookseller because they had published without securing permission. And the worst case scenario is that the rights holder could sue for infringement in the courts. So there are a number of significant consequences of not securing permission. So that concludes our review of the permissions questions. So we'd now like to ask you whether you have any questions for us. Okay, so we've had a number of questions that have been asked in the question box whilst we've been talking. So well, I'm going to talk through these. So there have been a number of questions about research and non-commercial purposes. So for example, does an MPhil paper and PhD thesis count as private study or research for non-commercial purposes? And who would be the publisher of a thesis? I think it's difficult to generalize about questions like this, but what I would do is refer you to the Intellectual Property Office website, and there is a section there which covers specifically exceptions to copyright. So it deals with those categories that I listed before, and there is there a section on non-commercial research and private study. And just to quote what that says, it says you're allowed to copy limited extracts of works when the use is for non-commercial research or private study, but you must be genuinely studying. So I think that what that means is if a paper or a thesis is actually published by a commercial publisher, then some of the fair dealing criteria that I mentioned before around competing with the original purpose would come into play. There's another question about would a map count as an illustration, and I think the answer to this is yes, it would be considered, it would fall under the artistic works category. Who would be the publisher of a thesis? Would that be the researcher? I think, again, it's difficult to provide a general answer to that. I know that universities often ask researchers to sign assignments, so I think it would depend upon the individual circumstances.
So we've got a couple of PLS Clear related questions. So do publishers get emails from the PLS Clear service when they have a new request? Yes, absolutely. They get pretty much the same notification as the requester does, so they can see it instantly when they have one. We've also got one about if about checking which publishers are signed up to PLS Clear before you search. There's not a way to do it through the system, but say for example if you're trying to submit a number of requests, then you're more than welcome to email us with those list of publishers to plsclear@pls.org.uk, and we're more than happy to check with you first, and then we can let you know which ones are and potentially not signed up with us.
We're just reading through questions, so we'll be back with you in a second.
In terms of, there's a question about whether a publisher to handle the permissions or the author. Is it up to the author to negotiate with a publisher? So it all depends on who holds the republication rights at the time. So if it's relatively newly published, then it will generally be the publisher. If it's quite an old title, there's a chance the rights can be reversed to the author, but that's on an individual publisher-author contract basis. So it's best to check with the publisher first, and then they could tell you, or through us, and we can say whether it's, when we speak to the publisher, whether it's rights averted or not.
There's a question. Do you have any idea of refusal rates? From an anecdotal point of view, and we do actually manage permissions businesses for a growing number of publishers, refusals are really uncommon. So I don't have a statistic, but it hardly ever happens.
There's one about how can a publisher get their work added to PLS Clear. So if you would like to contact us at plsclear@pls.org.uk, we're more than happy to walk you through the steps. It's just that there's quite a few of them to say on this webinar, but we're more than happy to help you afterwards.
There's a question about a website. If a website says copyright 1991 to 2012, does this mean it's out of copyright and can be used without permission? I haven't seen the website, but I think what that is indicating is that the content was written during that period. So I think you might infer that the content remains in copyright, but again, it's something that's worth asking the website holders, website developers specifically. Is there another question? Is there a central website for searching for the copyright holders of photographs? I think the answer to that is sadly not. Photographs are particularly challenging, I think, but it may be worth starting your search with commercial sites such as Getty Images and Shutterstock. We have a question, what constitutes fair diligence? And I think if that refers to the process of securing an orphan works license, actually that process of due diligence is quite complicated. But the Intellectual Property Office produce a handbook that details the steps that you need to take to secure a license. And I have to say that scheme, the orphan works scheme, is very new, but it is potentially a problem to a solution to a problem that occurs quite regularly. So I think that covers the questions that we've been asked. Does anyone have any further questions they'd like us to consider? Yes, so there's one further question. How should you proceed if the rights holder doesn't respond to requests? Well, if you're using PLS Clear, then we will, after a period of time, chase up on your behalf, and we do have a very good database of current contacts within publishing companies. It's certainly not advisable to, if you can't secure permission, to go ahead and reuse the content anyway. As I said, one option is to use the orphan work scheme.
So any further questions or any questions we haven't answered, we will follow up with you by email. Thank you very much for attending.